London, 1858. A photograph is taken in the quiet parlor of a grieving household. A young boy, George Prescott, only 9 years old, stands stiffly beside his brother. His hand rests gently on the shoulder of Herbert, 16, dressed in his best suit, seated motionless in an armchair. To anyone who sees it, the image is tragic but ordinary, a family memento mori, a final portrait of the dead. But what if this was not a portrait of death, but of life? Decades later, when the coffin was unearthed, the truth clawed its way back to the surface. Scratches inside the lid, broken bones in the hands, a twisted skeleton that told a story no family should ever face. Herbert Prescott had not been dead when the photograph was taken. He had been buried alive. This is the chilling story of the Prescott brothers, a tale that still haunts forensic medicine, photography, and the very question of what it means to die. If stories like this fascinate you, where history, mystery, and human tragedy collide, make sure to like this video, subscribe, and share it with someone who appreciates the darker corners of the past. Your support helps us bring more forgotten stories back to life. The Prescott household was quiet that morning, filled with a stillness that would soon turn to sorrow. George stood beside his older brother, Herbert, unaware that the moment would lead to a lifetime of questions. Herbert, though only 16, had become more than a brother to George. He was a protector, taking on responsibilities beyond his years after their father's untimely death, ensuring George's safety and well-being. Their father's death had cast a shadow over their home, but Herbert had kept things together. He guided George through every challenge, offering support and strength when everything seemed uncertain. That morning, the brothers had breakfast together as they usually did. Herbert seemed fine, though he briefly mentioned feeling tired, which George thought little of. After their meal, Herbert went to his room. George continued with his lessons, unaware of the tragedy waiting to unfold. Time passed without incident, but when dinner came and Herbert had not joined him, George's concern began to grow. The quietness of the house seemed to deepen as the evening wore on. Herbert, usually present and active, had been unusually absent. George decided to check on him, hoping for no more than a simple reason. When George opened the door to Herbert's room, he found his brother lying motionless on his bed. At first it appeared as though Herbert was simply resting, but the unnatural stillness immediately caught George's attention. His heart began to race as he moved closer to Herbert, calling his name. There was no response, no movement at all. The lifeless body of his brother sent a wave of dread through George. Herbert's skin was cold to the touch. George's mind raced as he called out again, desperately shaking his brother, but Herbert did not stir. The room felt heavy with an inescapable silence. Frantic, George ran to find Dr. Frederick Hastings, the family doctor. His steps were quick, the weight of his brother's condition driving him forward. Every moment felt like an eternity. Dr. Hastings arrived promptly and moved toward Herbert's body. The doctor began his examination, searching for any sign of life, but found nothing. Herbert remained as still and lifeless as when George first discovered him. There was no visible sign of illness or injury. Dr. Hastings checked Herbert for any possible cause of death, but nothing came up. The doctor's confusion was evident, yet he had to conclude that Herbert was dead. The diagnosis was baffling. Dr. Hastings recorded the cause as sudden death by indeterminate natural cause, a phrase that was commonly used in the absence of any clear explanation. There seemed to be no logical reason for the death. In the Victorian era, it was customary to bury the deceased quickly. Dr. Hastings advised that Herbert be buried within 48 hours, and preparations for the funeral began without delay. George, however, remained deeply troubled. The morning after Herbert's death, a local photographer named James Moreland was summoned to take a final portrait. The practice of post-mortem photography was common in those days, meant to memorialize loved ones. Herbert's body was carefully positioned in his favorite armchair, his face arranged to appear peaceful. George sat beside him, his hand resting on his brother's shoulder. The scene was meant to capture Herbert's memory. The photograph was a serene, final tribute to Herbert, a way to remember him, though George's heart could not escape the growing sense of unease that gripped him. The photograph would become both a memory and a haunting. As the photograph was taken, Moreland made a note in his journal. He observed that Herbert's face appeared unusually rosy for a dead body, attributing it to the brief time that had passed since his death. This seemingly minor observation would later play a crucial role in revealing the truth about Herbert's fate. But at the time, the photograph was simply meant to preserve Herbert's memory for George and the family. Herbert's funeral took place 2 days later, on November 16, 1858. The burial was a quiet affair, with a few local friends and colleagues present. George stood beside the grave, unable to comprehend the loss. The weight of the loss pressed down on George as he watched the earth cover his brother's coffin. He stayed by the grave long after the others had left, unwilling to let go of his brother's memory. In the years that followed, George grew up and moved forward with his life. He married, had children, and became a successful merchant, but the memory of Herbert's death haunted him. The photograph of Herbert, once a tribute to his brother's life, remained in George's home. It served as both a reminder of the bond they had shared and the pain of Herbert's sudden and unexplained death. The passing years did little to diminish the grief George carried. The haunting image of Herbert's still face, captured in that final photograph, was a constant reminder of the brother he had lost. But it wasn't until 1919, decades after Herbert's burial, that the truth began to unfold. Renovations at the local cemetery required the exhumation of several graves, including Herbert's. The discovery that followed would shock everyone. Dr. Horace Fairchild, a respected forensic pathologist, was tasked with overseeing the exhumations. What he discovered inside Herbert's coffin would cast a dark shadow on the events of 1858 and reveal the truth of Herbert's death. When Herbert's coffin was opened, the first thing Dr. Fairchild noticed was the remarkable preservation of the body. The oak coffin had withstood the test of time, but that wasn't the most disturbing aspect. The most disturbing discovery was the position of Herbert's body. Though he had been buried with his arms crossed over his chest, his body now lay with arms outstretched toward the coffin lid, as if struggling to escape. Upon closer examination, Dr. Fairchild found deep scratches on the inside of the coffin lid. These marks were unmistakably made by human nails, indicating that Herbert had fought desperately to break free after being buried. The more Dr. Fairchild examined the remains, the more the horrifying truth became clear. Herbert had not been dead when he was buried. He had regained consciousness inside the coffin and had fought for his life. The fractures on Herbert's fingers confirmed the struggle. They showed signs of prolonged digging, as if he had desperately tried to claw his way out of the confined space. The evidence was chilling. Even more disturbing were the fractures found on Herbert's skull. The small cracks at the base of his skull suggested that Herbert had experienced internal pressure, likely caused by struggling for air in a confined space. Dr. Fairchild documented everything carefully, knowing that this case would not only shed light on a personal tragedy, but would also have profound implications for the practice of forensic medicine. Herbert's case became one of the most studied in forensic history. It revealed the dangers of early medical practices and the limitations of the tools available to Victorian doctors when diagnosing death. Herbert had suffered a fate no one should ever endure. His death had been mistakenly confirmed, and he had been buried alive. The revelation was both horrifying and groundbreaking, forever changing the course of medical history. Though the discovery brought some resolution to the Prescott family, it also served as a stark reminder of the flaws in Victorian medicine. It was a lesson in the importance of accurate death confirmation. Herbert's story would be taught in medical schools for generations, a tragic yet essential case study in how medical science can evolve and improve. It was a lasting legacy born from a tragedy. For George, however, the discovery only deepened his grief. The knowledge that his brother had fought for his life inside the coffin added a layer of pain that he could never fully reconcile. Herbert's photograph, once a final tribute, now became a symbol of his struggle. It was no longer just a family memento, but a chilling reminder of the failure to recognize life when it was still present. The Prescott brothers' story would become a part of medical lore, a lesson in the limitations of 19th-century death diagnosis. It would influence the way death was confirmed for years to come. George never truly found peace. The loss of his brother was something he carried with him until the end of his life. But Herbert's legacy would continue to shape the medical world for decades. As time passed, the Prescott brothers' photograph became one of the most studied pieces of Victorian history. It was displayed in medical museums and discussed in academic circles, a symbol of life's fragility and the need for medical progress. Herbert's death, though tragic, led to vital changes in medical procedures, saving countless lives by preventing future cases of premature burial. The knowledge gained from his suffering would prevent similar tragedies. The story of the Prescott brothers serves as a reminder that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the most painful tragedies. Herbert's fate changed the course of medical history and saved lives. Though George never stopped grieving, he could at least take solace in knowing that his brother's death had not been in vain. The lessons learned from Herbert's suffering would resonate for generations. The legacy of Herbert Prescott endures. His story, though tragic, helped shape the future of medical science, and his photograph remains a testament to the fragility of life and the importance of accurate death diagnosis. Herbert Prescott had been more than just a sibling to George. He was his protector, the one who assumed responsibility after their father's death. At just 16, Herbert took on a father's role. After their father's tragic accident, Herbert was left to shoulder the weight of their family's survival. Though only 16, he had become a pillar of strength, his actions speaking volumes about his maturity. The absence of their father had left a void in the Prescott household. Herbert, in his quiet way, filled that space. He worked hard, looked after George, and kept their world together despite the challenges. George never questioned Herbert's strength. He saw in his older brother someone who always knew what to do, someone who was both a role model and a source of comfort in an uncertain world. While Herbert worked hard in his apprenticeship, he never neglected his responsibilities at home. He helped George with his lessons and made sure they were both fed, dressed, and prepared for whatever life threw their way. The two brothers had become inseparable in many ways. With Herbert as the constant presence in his life, George found security in knowing that no matter what, Herbert would always be there for him. Herbert's discipline, combined with his deep sense of duty, made him a figure of stability in their home. For George, life was simpler with Herbert's guidance, and the world felt less threatening because of him. On November 14, 1858, there was no sign that anything was wrong. The morning was quiet, but it carried with it a foreboding sense of the unexpected. George had no idea how quickly their world would change. That morning, George and Herbert shared a simple breakfast, their conversation light, their plans for the day routine. Herbert briefly mentioned feeling fatigued, but this didn't concern George. Nothing about that morning seemed unusual. Herbert retired to his room after breakfast, leaving George to his lessons. The hours passed without incident. But as the evening approached and Herbert had not come down, George began to feel uneasy. It was unlike Herbert to stay upstairs for so long. Concerned, George knocked on his brother's door, but there was no answer. He opened the door, expecting to find his brother resting, but the sight inside froze him. Herbert lay motionless on the bed, his face serene. At first, George thought his brother was just asleep, but something about the stillness was off. Too still, too quiet. Herbert had never been so quiet before. Rushing to Herbert's side, George called his brother's name, shaking him gently. There was no response. The lifeless body before him filled George with an overwhelming sense of dread. His brother was gone. Frantic, George ran to fetch Dr. Hastings, the family doctor. Dr. Hastings, a man who had known both brothers for years, arrived quickly to examine Herbert, but no explanation could be found for the sudden death. Herbert's body was cold, and all signs of life had vanished. Dr. Hastings checked for external causes, illness, trauma, or poisoning, but nothing. His diagnosis, though inconclusive, would change George's life forever. Dr. Hastings recorded the cause as sudden death by indeterminate natural cause. There was no further explanation. The reality of the situation struck George. His brother, his protector, was gone without a trace. The suddenness of it all left George reeling. The quiet house, once filled with Herbert's presence, now seemed empty and lifeless. The air grew thick with grief, a grief George could barely understand at his age. Though he was young, George understood that this loss would change everything. Herbert had been his guide, his constant, and now he was gone. Nothing would ever be the same again. With a heavy heart, the family made preparations for the funeral. Herbert was to be buried quickly, as was customary, and the house that had once been full of life would now feel painfully silent. James Morland, the photographer, arrived the following day to take Herbert's final portrait. Post-mortem photographs were common in Victorian England, a way to preserve memories of loved ones, but this photograph would carry dark significance. Morland carefully positioned Herbert in his favorite armchair, arranging him to appear peaceful. George, still in shock, sat beside him, hand resting on Herbert's shoulder, a gesture that seemed both tender and unnatural. As the photograph was taken, Morland noted that Herbert's face had a slightly rosy hue, a detail he attributed to good circulation, given the short time since death. But the truth was much darker. The photograph, while capturing Herbert's final moment, would later serve as the key to unraveling the terrifying truth. It would reveal that Herbert had not been dead when the picture was taken. 2 days later, Herbert was buried. George remained at the grave site long after the others had left, unwilling to leave his brother's side. The earth covered the coffin, but George's grief seemed to keep him rooted to the spot. The years that followed were filled with quiet mourning. George grew into a young man, becoming a respected member of the community, but the shadow of Herbert's death remained with him, always lurking. As he grew older, George often thought back to that day. He would remember the photograph, the stillness of his brother, and wonder about the strange feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. The questions remained unanswered, but life moved on. George married, had children, and eventually became a successful merchant. Yet the photograph of Herbert remained in his living room, a constant reminder of what had been lost. But it wasn't until 1919, when the cemetery was undergoing renovations, that the true horror of Herbert's fate began to be revealed. The exhumation of Herbert's body would provide shocking new insights. Dr. Horace Fairchild, an expert in forensic pathology, was assigned to oversee the exhumations. What he uncovered would forever alter the course of George's life and expose the horrifying truth of Herbert's final moments. When Herbert's coffin was opened, the first thing Dr. Fairchild noticed was the state of preservation. The oak coffin had held up remarkably well, but that wasn't the most chilling discovery. The body, which had been buried with arms crossed, was now found with arms extended toward the coffin lid. The body had shifted inside the coffin. It was clear that Herbert had fought for his life. Further examination revealed deep scratch marks on the inside of the coffin lid, marks that could only have been made by human nails. Herbert had struggled to escape, desperate for air in the confined space. The more Dr. Fairchild examined the body, the clearer the truth became. Herbert had not died when he was buried. He had been mistakenly declared dead, and then had regained consciousness inside the coffin. The fractures on Herbert's fingers provided further evidence of his struggle. They were consistent with someone trying to dig through the wood and earth, clawing for freedom, for air. It was a desperate fight for survival. Dr. Fairchild's findings were a shocking revelation. He concluded that Herbert had been in a state of suspended animation, mistakenly thought dead, and had regained consciousness after being sealed in the coffin. The skull fractures suggested extreme internal pressure, likely caused by struggling to breathe in the confined space. The evidence painted a harrowing picture of Herbert's final moments. This discovery would become one of the most studied cases in forensic medicine. It was a stark reminder of the limitations of Victorian medical knowledge and the terrifying consequences of those limitations. Herbert's case became a cautionary tale, used in medical schools around the world to teach future doctors the importance of accurate death diagnosis and the dangers of premature burial. For George, the revelation only deepened his grief. The knowledge that his brother had struggled, trapped in a coffin, was a burden that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Herbert's photograph, once a final tribute to his life, now became a chilling symbol of his struggle. The picture that was meant to preserve Herbert's memory now captured the haunting truth of his death. Though Herbert's story led to advancements in death confirmation, for George, it was a constant reminder of the pain and suffering his brother had endured. The truth had not set him free. As the years passed, George's grief remained, though he continued to live his life. The photograph of Herbert remained on the wall, a testament to a brother lost and a tragedy that changed history. Herbert Prescott's legacy endures, not only in the lessons learned from his death, but in the lives saved by the changes that followed. His story became a key turning point in the history of forensic medicine. Though George could never forget his brother's tragic fate, he could take comfort in knowing that Herbert's suffering had helped prevent similar tragedies from occurring. His brother's death had not been in vain. Herbert Prescott's photograph, a symbol of both life and death, continues to be studied and discussed. It serves as a reminder that even in death, there are stories yet to be told. In 1919, more than 6 decades after Herbert's burial, the Prescott family's hidden truth was set to emerge. The local cemetery, undergoing renovations to accommodate war casualties, required the exhumation of several graves, including Herbert's. The task of exhuming the bodies was entrusted to Dr. Horace Fairchild, a pioneering forensic pathologist known for his expertise in handling such delicate operations. He had no idea that his work would soon uncover a medical mystery. As the workers unearthed the old graves, they came to Herbert's plot. The quality of the oak coffin, combined with the soil conditions, ensured that the body inside was remarkably well preserved after all these years. When the coffin was finally opened, Dr. Fairchild noticed something unusual. Herbert's body, though well preserved, was not positioned as it had been when buried. His arms, once crossed over his chest, were now extended outward. This shift in position raised an immediate question. Why had Herbert's body moved inside the coffin? It was an unsettling discovery, one that suggested something had happened after the burial, something that defied explanation. Dr. Fairchild's curiosity grew as he continued to examine the body. The next disturbing sign was found on the inside of the coffin lid. Deep scratches, clearly made by human nails, marking the wood. The scratches inside the lid could only mean one thing. Herbert had tried to escape. His hands had made desperate attempts to free himself, to break through the confined space of the coffin. The discovery sent shockwaves through Dr. Fairchild's mind. Herbert had not been dead when he was buried. Instead, he had been in a state of suspended animation, thought dead, and had regained consciousness in the coffin. Dr. Fairchild documented the findings, each detail confirming what no one could have imagined. Herbert's body showed signs of extreme physical distress, with fractures on his fingers and nails filled with dirt. The evidence was undeniable. Herbert had fought desperately to survive, trying to break free from the coffin, using whatever strength he had left to claw at the wood. It was a horrific image. As the forensic investigation continued, the details grew more disturbing. Fragments of wood remained embedded under Herbert's nails, a clear sign that he had been scraping against the inside of the coffin for an extended period. The evidence was harrowing, yet it was also groundbreaking. Dr. Fairchild's analysis revealed that Herbert had struggled for survival after being buried alive. The realization sent ripples through the medical community. Dr. Fairchild had seen many exhumations in his time, but nothing like this. The clarity with which the evidence spoke made it painfully obvious that Herbert had been buried prematurely and had fought against the odds. Herbert's skull, when examined closely, revealed another chilling discovery: fractures at the base of the skull, consistent with the kind of internal pressure caused by struggling for breath in a confined space. It was clear now that Herbert had not simply passed away quietly. He had struggled for life, his body locked in a coffin, unable to escape. The trauma to his body painted a vivid picture of his final moments. The horrific truth of Herbert's death was becoming clearer with every passing minute. The diagnosis of death had been wrong, and the result was a tragedy that had remained hidden for far too long. Herbert's case, once a simple family tragedy, was now a landmark in forensic medicine. The implications of this discovery were far-reaching, forever changing the understanding of what happens when death is misdiagnosed. This was not just a case of premature burial. It was a failure in medical science itself. The inability to detect life in the faintest of signs had led to Herbert's unnecessary suffering and ultimate death. As Dr. Fairchild continued his examination, the details became more vivid. Herbert's arms, stretched out as if reaching for freedom, were a poignant symbol of the last moments of a life tragically misunderstood. The nails, worn down from desperate clawing, revealed the extent of Herbert's struggle. The damage to his fingers indicated a frantic, prolonged effort to escape the confines of his grave, his final fight for air. What was supposed to be a peaceful death had instead been a fight for survival, a nightmare that Herbert had lived through in the dark, confined space of the coffin. The agony of those moments was beyond comprehension. The exhumation revealed much more than anyone had expected. The coffin, though sealed tightly, had shown evidence of movement. Herbert had not simply died peacefully, he had been alive, trapped in his grave. Dr. Fairchild's meticulous work uncovered the painful reality of premature burial. Herbert's case would go down in history as one of the most disturbing examples of medical misdiagnosis, a warning for generations to come. For George, the revelation was a devastating blow. The knowledge that his brother had suffered, trapped in a coffin, unable to escape, tore at his soul. The guilt and sorrow that flooded him were indescribable. Though the truth had been uncovered, it offered George no comfort. The image of his brother struggling for survival in that dark, confined space would forever haunt his memory. The grief was overwhelming. Herbert's story, while tragic, became an essential lesson in medical history. It exposed the limitations of Victorian-era medical practices and served as a stark reminder of how easily death could be misjudged. The revelation of Herbert's true fate brought no peace to George. It only added another layer of grief to the years of mourning he had already endured. The loss of his brother would never be fully healed. The case became a crucial moment in the history of forensic medicine. It sparked a wave of reforms in the way doctors confirmed death, leading to advancements that would save countless lives in the future. Though Herbert's death was a tragedy, it led to progress in medical science. His suffering had not been in vain, as it had spurred changes that would prevent future cases of premature burial. The Prescott family's pain was now a part of history. Herbert's case, studied by medical experts, became a key turning point in the evolution of medical knowledge. It highlighted the importance of precise death confirmation. For George, the grief remained, even as the world moved forward. The knowledge that his brother's death had led to significant changes in medical practice could not ease the suffering that had defined his life. Though the truth about Herbert's death was finally revealed, it left a scar that would never heal. The haunting image of his brother's struggle, captured in the details of his body, remained with George forever. Herbert's legacy lived on in the lessons learned from his tragic fate. His death became a symbol of the progress made in medical science, a constant reminder of how far the world had come since his time. George never fully recovered from the pain of losing Herbert. The exhumation and its shocking revelations only deepened the grief, leaving George with an unbearable burden, the knowledge of what his brother had endured. Herbert Prescott's case remained a profound part of medical history, a lesson that would never be forgotten. It was a stark reminder that medical knowledge evolves, often at the cost of human lives. The photograph of Herbert, once a simple family memento, became a symbol of the uncertainty between life and death. It stood as both a tribute to Herbert's life and a reminder of his suffering. The story of Herbert Prescott's premature burial would continue to influence generations of medical professionals, shaping how death was determined and ensuring that such a tragedy would never be repeated. Herbert's legacy, though rooted in tragedy, became a turning point in the medical field. His case highlighted the flaws in Victorian medical practices, forever changing how death was confirmed in the years that followed. The Prescott brothers' story was not just a personal tragedy, it had profound implications for medicine. It exposed the limitations of the era's understanding of death and forced doctors to confront their shortcomings. George, though older and wiser, never fully recovered from the loss of Herbert. The knowledge of what his brother had endured haunted him, casting a shadow over his entire life, no matter how much time passed. The photograph, once a simple memento, became a symbol of the past. A stark reminder of a brother's struggle, an image frozen in time that would forever carry the weight of its dark truth. Years passed, but the pain never fully subsided for George. The image of Herbert, serene yet lifeless in the photograph, stayed with him, a constant reminder of the horrifying reality that had remained hidden for so long. Though George went on to live a full life, his brother's death would always be a heavy burden. Every achievement, every moment of joy, was colored by the shadow of Herbert's tragic fate. The exhumation in 1919, though it brought answers, only deepened the wounds for George. The knowledge of Herbert's final struggle did not bring peace. It only reinforced the sense of helplessness that had marked his brother's death. Herbert's story became a topic of study in medical circles. The details of his struggle for life, the scratches in the coffin lid, the fractures in his fingers, each discovery added to the legacy of his painful death. The case of the Prescott brothers became a turning point for death confirmation practices in the medical community. The tragedy led to changes that would prevent similar mistakes in the future, saving countless lives. Despite the progress, the pain of Herbert's death never truly faded for George. Every time he thought of his brother, it was not with peace, but with the haunting image of a young man trapped in a coffin. Herbert's story remained a cautionary tale. It was used to teach future doctors about the dangers of premature burial and the importance of accurate death diagnosis. It was a dark lesson that would never be forgotten. George's life, though successful, was always weighed down by the grief of losing Herbert. The memory of that fateful day, the photograph, and the knowledge of his brother's suffering lingered in his mind, never letting him go. Herbert's photograph, once a symbol of love and remembrance, now stood as a silent witness to the mistakes of the past. It was both a tribute to a brother lost and a chilling reminder of his final moments. The changes in medical practice following Herbert's death were significant, but they came at a great cost. The tragedy that befell Herbert Prescott could never be undone, and its scars would remain for generations. For George, the years didn't bring comfort. They only brought more questions. He often wondered if there had been something he could have done differently, something that could have saved his brother from his fate. The exhumation, while it brought answers, also confirmed the deepest fears George had always held. Herbert's struggle, locked in that coffin, was now a fact, and that truth would never leave George's mind. The photograph, taken at a time of profound grief, now became a symbol of everything George had lost. It was a reminder that life is fragile, that death can be misjudged, and that some truths are too painful to bear. Though George lived on, married and had children, the shadow of Herbert's death loomed over him. Every achievement, every joy was bittersweet, knowing that his brother's life had ended in such a cruel and horrifying way. Herbert's case, now etched in medical history, influenced future generations of doctors and forensic experts. The study of his death became a crucial part of the education on death and the vital importance of confirming it. For George, the years passed, but the pain of losing his brother remained as fresh as ever. It was a pain that could never be fully healed, a wound that would remain open for the rest of his life. The story of the Prescott brothers, though tragic, became a key moment in history. Herbert's death, though a horrific mistake, had spurred important changes that would prevent future suffering. His story would never be forgotten. The knowledge that Herbert's death had led to significant reforms in medical practice did little to ease George's grief. He could not find solace in the fact that his brother's suffering had contributed to progress. In the years following the exhumation, the Prescott brothers' story became a source of reflection and study. It reminded everyone that life and death are far more complex than we understand, and that mistakes can have devastating consequences. Though George never stopped grieving, he came to realize that Herbert's legacy was one of change. His brother's tragic fate had altered the course of medical history, ensuring that no other family would suffer as they had. Herbert's story, though one of suffering, became a story of progress. His death had led to advances in death confirmation practices, and his case was cited as a warning to future generations of medical professionals. For George, the tragedy of his brother's death would never fade, but the changes that followed provided a bittersweet sense of closure. Herbert's life, though short, had left an indelible mark on the world. The Prescott brothers' legacy was not just one of loss, but of the profound impact that a single life can have on the course of history. Herbert's story would continue to shape the future of medicine for years to come. The photograph of Herbert, once a final memento, became a symbol of the fragility of life and the need for accurate medical practices. It was a haunting reminder of the fine line between life and death. As George grew older, he often thought back to the time he spent with Herbert. He remembered the quiet moments, the lessons learned, and the bond they had shared. But he could never escape the pain. Herbert's tragic fate had forced the world to confront the limitations of its medical knowledge. It had pushed society to question how death was diagnosed and to develop better practices to prevent future mistakes. The photograph of Herbert, though painful to look at, remained in George's home, a reminder of the life he had lost and the lessons learned from his brother's suffering. It was a symbol of both grief and progress. The Prescott brothers' story would continue to resonate through the years. It was a reminder that life is fragile, that death is not always what it seems, and that sometimes the truth is more painful than we can imagine. Herbert Prescott's legacy lived on, not just in the history of forensic medicine, but in the hearts of those who remembered him. His death, though tragic, had changed the world in ways that could never be undone. George, though burdened by grief, could take solace in the fact that his brother's story had led to meaningful change. Herbert's death was a dark chapter, but it had sparked a new understanding of life and death. Herbert Prescott's story is a powerful reminder that sometimes the most profound lessons come from the most painful tragedies. His legacy, though born from suffering, would continue to influence generations of doctors and families alike.